most famous nightclub in the world, the Cavern, Liverpool, where on the 5th of February 1961, 4 young Liverpool lads took to that stage and started a musical sensation that would rock the world. The Cavern stage is the perfect setting to welcome you to Days in the Life, the Lost Beatles archive video. This video will give you a real insight into the lives of the Beatles. We'll show you the houses where John, Paul, George and Ringo grew up, the schools they attended and the pubs they drank in. We'll show you the places in London and Liverpool where they drew their inspiration and where they left such a profound impact. It was in this tiny council house, number 174 Mackett's Lane, that the youngest member of the Beatles, George Harrison, lived. His father was a bus driver, and the family lived here until 1965, when the pressure of fame forced them to move to a house in nearby Warrington that George bought for his father. The English National Trust have bought this house, 20 Fortlin Road, in the leafy Allerton suburb of Liverpool, and restored it to its original 60s condition. That's because it was here in 1955 that Paul McCartney moved with his family. His father was also a musician and encouraged Paul's early musical aspirations. The young Paul, like so many young men after him, discovered that the acoustics in the bathroom here made up for the lack of amplification, and spent many hours practicing his guitar. Having met John Lennon, the front room became a regular rehearsal venue. In stark contrast to the relative prosperity of the areas where John, Paul and George grew up, Richard Starkey, Ringo Starr, was born here in the working class heart of Liverpool, the Dingle, at number 9 Madryn Street. This house that heard Ringo Starr's first newborn cries is now derelict, the windows boarded up. Ringo lived here for 6 years, until his mother, to take advantage of lower rents, swapped this house with a friend and moved across the way to Admiral Grove. Ringo lived here at number 10 Admiral Grove from the age of 6 until he found fame and fortune with the Beatles. The pub on the corner, the Empress, appeared on the album cover of his first solo album, Sentimental Journeys. And Ringo's stepfather and his mother clung on to this house until the fan power pushed them out, and Ringo bought them a house, ironically, in the area where Paul, George and John's parents already lived. One of the many myths that have built up around the Beatles is that John Lennon was a working-class hero brought up in the slums of Liverpool. In fact, he spent more time in this pretty little middle-class house, number 251 Menlove Avenue, than he did in any other place throughout his 40-year life. He was brought up here by his Aunt Mimi and his Uncle George, and you can almost imagine the young John Lennon walking through these gates and down this street. Every morning, the young John Lennon would walk down this beautiful tree-lined avenue. Little has changed since the 1950s. He'd have passed this park on my left on his way to Quarry Bank School right over there. It was here at Quarry Bank School, now called Calderston School, that John started his famous skiffle group, the Quarrymen, and showed signs of the rebellious young man that he'd later grow up to be. In fact, he spent so much time on his music and editing the satirical school newspaper that he failed all of his exams, even his beloved art. But he later went on to the Liverpool School of Art. So it was goodbye Quarry Bank, hello the future. As well as being a songwriter, John Lennon was a poet and a talented artist. He studied here at the Liverpool College of Art, which was very convenient because it was just round the corner from where Paul and George were going to high school. The Liverpool Institute, behind me, was Paul McCartney and George Harrison's secondary school. Paul was a natural student and passed his exams with ease, while George, the natural rebel, hated to wear the school uniform. When the building was closed, Paul bought it and established the Liverpool School for Performing Arts, not unlike New York's Fame School. It's just possible by doing this that one day you may see another group of Liverpool lads capture the world's musical stage from the humble beginnings of this sandstone building. This imposing sandstone church behind me may seem an unlikely place to stop on our journey through the Beatles' history, but it was here on the 6th of July 1957 that a young Paul McCartney was brought to see the Quarrymen, John Lennon's skiffle group. In a field behind this church, Paul saw the young John Lennon play for the first time and was very impressed, even though John forgot many of the words to the 50 songs he was singing and had to improvise. Ken Rawlinson, you're the caretaker of St. Peter's Church.
I am, yes.
Can you tell us about the Beatles' connection with this church?
Well, basically, we had a fair day 40 years ago, and this is where John and Paul actually met.
And was that in a field behind this church?
Yes, that was in the afternoon and in the field.
Can you tell us why they met here?
Well, they were booked for the day as a skiffle group, and then in the afternoon they played on the field, and in the evening they played in the church hall over the road.
And that was the only time they'd played there?
As far as we know, yes.
And I believe that the older residents of the church hall left rather quickly when the skiffle began.
That's right, yes, and the children thought it was great.
And I believe you commemorated the 40th anniversary of the meeting.
That's right, we did that last year, and the skiffle group chaps who are still around, the old Quarrymen, they came along and played in the evening again, after a bit of practice in the week, and it was again a repeat of the 40 years ago as a fair day.
If you look around this graveyard, you'll find the occasional inspirational clue to the Beatles' presence. Eleanor Rigby's gravestone, Father Mackenzie, all lying in front of the church where the wedding had been.
We've got Eleanor Rigby's grave just here. We think they picked that out at random, as they picked out Penny Lane. Eleanor Rigby has, I think it's 1 or 2 half-sisters, and they still come to the graveyard to put flowers on other graves as well as the Eleanor Rigby one.
Penny Lane, where a barber collected photographs. And the photographs that you have in Days in the Life, the Lost Beatles archive, are of the 4 lads from Liverpool that made this road world famous. An unremarkable little Liverpool street that's become a household word, Penny Lane. When John wrote Penny Lane with Paul, he said he was reliving his childhood. He was brought up for the first 5 years of his life in Newcastle Road and used to walk past Penny Lane every morning on his way to school. The bank, the barber shop were here. The fish and finger pie shelter stood there where Sergeant Pepper's licensed restaurant now stands. On the other corner, Woolworths, where Cynthia Lennon worked and where she went into labour with Julian Lennon. And in front of me, the parish church of St. Barnabas, where the Quarrymen often played. Strawberry Field, immortalised by John Lennon, was a place very dear to his heart. He'd walk through this very gate with his Aunt Mimi to visit the summer fetes. And where once a beautiful Victorian mansion stood, there's now a red brick building that John helped to build. It's still a Salvation Army children's home, and the association goes on. As you can see, the gate is covered with the messages and thoughts of the fans that cover every building that are associated with the Beatles. Strawberry Fields forever. In the early 1960s, Matthew Street in Liverpool was the place where young people wanted to be. The reason? It was where the Cavern Club opened its doors and quickly made a name for itself as the place where exciting new music was heard, played by new groups. Today, the fame of the Cavern Club has spread around the world, and the area has become a magnet for Beatles fans from every corner of the globe. Walk down the street and you'll meet John Lennon. High on the wall, a memorial to the world's greatest ever band. Close to the legendary Cavern Club, you'll find these specially commissioned bronze statues of the Fab Four. And here, in the rebuilt Cavern Club, Beatles fans still come in their thousands to soak up the rich atmosphere of those long ago, but never to be forgotten days. The Cavern opened as a jazz club in 1957, and the Beatles played here 292 times. As their popularity grew, so did their audiences, until eventually so many Liverpool teenagers crowded into this tiny room to see their heroes play, that the sweat from their bodies caused condensation to drip from the ceiling onto the Beatles' instruments and fuse their amplifiers. You could say it was a truly electrifying atmosphere. The famous grapes. Every night after a hard performance, at the Cavern just up the street, the lads would come to this landmark Liverpool pub. They drink here, at this very bar.
Cool. It's not right.
Here we are in Abbey Road, northwest London. And this is the famous crossing?
No, not that crossing. It's that crossing, which is the most famous crossing in the world. Basically, Abbey Road, the studio where the Beatles recorded between 1962 and 1970, almost every single one of their famous tracks.
So there must be some extraordinary stories.
Well, there will be if we can make it across this crossing in one piece.
Well done.
Like that. So, over there, the studio and the wall covered in graffiti is the only real sign that that is a recording studio. Most studios are very unassuming. This really gives it away.
It's almost a shrine to the Beatles.
It is. It's a place where people from around the world come morning, noon, night. The graffiti in all languages showing, you know, how people's love for the group has existed to this day.
And how about the building itself? What stories could that building tell us about the Beatles?
A lot. There are 3 studios in there that they recorded in. Studio 1 is the largest recording area where they would do orchestral recordings, such as that for A Day in the Life on the Sgt. Pepper album. Studio 2 is where they did most of their famous sessions. And Studio 3 was used during the White Album, for instance, in 1968, where they were using 3 studios at once, and they would often use Studio 3 as well. And if you talk about stories that the studio could tell, well, I'm sure that roof could tell a story. It was during one session in 1967 when John Lennon was tripping on LSD, and he suddenly came over pretty ill, and so the other Beatles carried him up to the roof so that he could get some air in the middle of the session, and then he went back to the recording.
Are they ever seen here today?
Well, Paul McCartney does come back here periodically. He does have his own home studio now in Sussex, but when he has to do an orchestral recording for one of his albums, Studio 1 in Abbey Road is one of the most famous studios in the world for orchestral recordings, and so he will come here.
Where are you girls from?
I'm from Rome, Italy.
Australia.
So 2 from Australia, where the Beatles were absolutely huge in the 60s.
Enormous.
Enormous? They're still enormous today.
Still.
But kids of your age still love them?
Yeah, for sure. Our dads have passed all their LPs down and, you know, got the CDs now.
And you've come all the way to Abbey Road to see the studio?
Yeah, for sure.
We wanted to show this place. We wanted
Yeah.
to see this place. Yeah, we love the Beatles.
You've come all the way from Norway to see the Abbey Road studios.
Yes, you know, Beatles mean such a lot for me, so that's why I just had to come here.
And are the Beatles still very big in Norway?
Oh yes, Beatles big in Norway. They will always be.
What's brought you from Australia to Abbey Road studios?
To visit the hallowed turf where the Beatles once were.
Are you a huge Beatles fan?
I certainly am, yes.
And what was your favourite Beatles song, would you have thought, Dad?
Oh, there's just so many. It'd be hard to pick one.
Are there a lot of big Beatles fans still in Australia?
Oh, most definitely. Every generation. There's a new group of Beatles fans there.
Presumably some of this graffiti's been here since the 60s.
I don't think so. In the 60s, this was absolutely beautiful and pristine white. And so it is every 3 months, believe it or not.
Really?
This is just the last 3 months of graffiti that you see. And the studio does its best every time just to keep it clean, and the fans come straight back.
So Richard, this is the London Apollo, but it didn't always look like this, did it?
No, back in 1964, Christmas of 1964, you would have seen the letters, the Beatles Christmas show, right across the front. It was a package show that they did for their fans, so comedy and music. And in those days, this was, of course, the Hammersmith Odeon. And then in Christmas of 65, they did another Beatles Christmas show. Didn't repeat it in 66. But the main reason that we're here really is not so much for what they did during the Christmas shows, but for an interesting little artifact around the back of the building.
So Richard, this wrought iron staircase looms large in the Beatles legend.
That's right. 1964, they film A Hard Day's Night. They're supposed to be filming at the Scala Theatre. They're in rehearsals for a TV show in the film. And at one point they decide just to get away from all the pressure and escape. So Ringo comes out of the door here, supposed to be the back of the studio, and so it says something like, "We're out," or "We're free," and the Beatles all come rushing down here, and that's when it goes into the "Can't Buy Me Love" song sequence.
I remember, and they rush off into that field there.
Yep, except the field was never there, just a parking lot. Basically, the field was just cut together from a totally different part of the British Isles.
Presumably there was a field there at one point, though.
What, here?
Yeah.
No, never.
Is it like the 12th century?
Possible, but then this wasn't here either. All right, so let's relive that moment.
Okay, do you want to go for it?
Absolutely, here we go.
Behind us is the Prince of Wales Theatre. This was the venue for the Beatles' most famous British concert, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was November 1963. They played the Royal Command performance in the presence of the Queen Mother and Princess Margaret. And there's a shot actually in the book of a few of the Beatles meeting the dignitaries after the show. The other thing about this show, which is extremely famous, was John Lennon's remark prior to the Beatles' fourth and final song of the evening. He basically asked the people in the cheaper seats if they would clap their hands on the next number, Twist and Shout, and if the rest of you would just rattle your jewellery. And in 1963, that was quite a risque gag, basically, but fortunately it went down pretty well with the whole audience. And, you know, the Beatles were just lovable and cheeky and impudent. So that was, you know, another rung up the ladder for the Beatles. For many people, it would have been the pinnacle of their career. For the Beatles, it was just, as I say, a rung up the ladder and on to the next big thing, which happened to be around the corner for them in the United States.
This is number 94 Baker Street. I believe this used to be a very different building in the 60s.
That's right. In December of 1967, the Beatles decided to go retail. They wanted to branch out from, you know, just the music world that they were involved in up to that point. And so they opened their own retail outlet. And it was very much, it was the Apple Boutique. And it was very much stocking the kind of clothes of the day, the psychedelic way out clothes of the swinging 60s in London. And they had a group called The Fall design a giant psychedelic mural around the top of the building, going right the way around the corner. Unfortunately for the Beatles and for the Fall, who did so much work on this, the local residents, local business people complained so much that the council forced them to whitewash the walls, get rid of the mural. And the boutique itself didn't last a whole lot longer. It basically lost money. People didn't obviously dig the clothes as much as the Beatles themselves did. So within months, they decided to shut it down. The Beatles and their wives came in one night, took all the choice stock as they saw it, and then the next day, it was a giveaway. People were lining up around the block taking all the clothes away for nothing.
But at one point this was a core part of the business.
Absolutely, yeah. But it was also the way that Apple began to unravel.
Piccadilly Circus, the heart of London. Here we have the London Pavilion, which is now a shopping arcade, but I believe in the 60s this was a cinema.
That's right, and in fact it was the place where the Beatles had the premieres of their films A Hard Day's Night, Help, and in 1968 Yellow Submarine, and all of them were Royal World charity gala premieres. That was the status of the Beatles in the 60s. In the book we actually have a photo of the Beatles arriving at the premiere for Help in 1965, and on all three occasions for their premieres, the traffic in Piccadilly Circus was brought to an absolute standstill. Thousands of people mobbing the streets, and you know, just amazing occasions every time. And it showed their pulling power even through to the end of the decade, that they could mob the streets like that just by turning up together.
Even though there's no number on the gate, I know this is 7 Cavendish Avenue. What's so special about this pretty Georgian building?
Well, basically there is no number 7 on there because the fans would chip it off, you see. The last photo in the book dates from 1966, and that was the year that Paul McCartney bought this house in St John's Wood, just around the corner from the Abbey Road studios. George Harrison got married that same year, Ringo was married with a family, and they all lived out of London, basically. And so Paul was the swinging bachelor, as I said, in London, and the Beatles would often gather here before a session or even after a recording session, as it was just, you know, around the corner. And in fact, he still owns it. He lived here until 1978, but since then, his children, as they've grown up and been, you know, like young adults, they've basically moved in here for a time and moved out. In the 60s, this was a shrine for the Beatles fan, a gathering place. Either it would be their Apple office building in the centre of London, or Paul McCartney's house. All the fans would be outside here, all the girls, and Paul, always a great public relations guy, would come out here and sign autographs and chat with them and pose for photos. So it's still a very famous place, and that's why the number's not here.
And the scene of some incredible parties in the 60s.
Absolutely. There's even a story that in 1969, when the Beatles were on the outs with one another, that basically it was John, George and Ringo had a major gripe with Paul, and one night they came past here and Paul wasn't in, and John jumped over these gates and threw a brick through the window and then hopped back over and back in the limo, and off they went. Paul also got quite upset at one point because some of the fans came into the house one day when he wasn't here, and they started basically going in and going through his clothes and stealing underwear and things like that, and when he got to find out, he actually did get very angry about it. But as I say, you know, a major shrine.
Do you think that's one of the reasons why he had to move out eventually into the country?
Well, maybe it was one of the reasons, but I think he also always loved the country life. His bachelor days were well and truly over by 78, and so, you know, he wanted to have, like, the leisure of living out in the countryside amongst the animals, being, you know, major animal rights activists, he and Linda. But as I say, he held on to it, and even today, sometimes when he's in town, it's not that often, but sometimes in town, if he does do a session at Abbey Road or something, and it's late night, it's 2 in the morning, rather than drive back to Sussex, they might stay here the night.
So this is London's famous Savile Row, in the heart of Mayfair, the most respectable, richest part of the city. What has this building got to do with the Beatles?
Number 3, Savile Row, was the headquarters of their Apple empire in the late 60s. They acquired the building, I think, in about 1967, and they kept it right through the 70s, actually. But in the late 60s, this was another congregating point for the fans. They'd all be out here and they'd see the Beatles coming and going almost every day into the Apple offices. In the basement of the building, they had their own recording studio, which in the film Let It Be, in the second half of the film, you see them in that recording studio with Billy Preston on keyboards. And believe it or not, even this door has got a certain amount of importance attached to it. Maybe not this specific door, but in the late 60s, especially in the 70s after the group had disbanded, fans would come here again from around the world, as at Abbey Road studios, same thing. They would come here and write graffiti all over the door, even etch them, you know, messages with pen knives, because the door was all white in those days. And eventually that door was auctioned off. And then a second door was put on, and exactly the same thing happened all over again. Eventually, though, the Beatles, Apple company did vacate the premises altogether. Another company has obviously since moved in. They've now got this nice varnished door, and it seems that everyone's leaving it alone, apart from the fact that number 3 has clearly been winched off it.
So if the Beatles were always recording at Abbey Road, why did they need a studio here in Savile Row?
Well, in the late 60s, they just thought they were infallible by that point, and you know, they just thought they could do everything better than anyone else. So Abbey Road only had 8-track recording. They had a guy who said they could have 72-track recording, which these days is possible, but back in '68 was like, no way. And there was a friend of theirs called Magic Alex, who was Alexis Mardis, a Greek guy, who was like an ideas man and one of the many spongers who hooked onto the Beatles. And he said that he could construct this studio as an electronics wizard who had befriended John Lennon, and he could construct this 72-track studio for them. So during the Let It Be filming, they then decided to switch from Twickenham Film Studios and go to their own Apple studio. And when they walked in there was this room with 72 little speakers wired up and a recording console, which one of the engineers has told me he likened it to the console of a B-52 bomber. And it was almost hand-carved, he said, and when they basically tried to turn it on and everything, there was just noise coming out of this thing. It was absolutely useless. Magic Alex has also promised that instead of having screens around Ringo's drums to screen off the sound from the rest of the band, he would have an invisible force shield. That's the point at which George Martin, their producer, told me that he thought this is a complete joke. So they went in the studio and it was absolutely terrible, and they had to gut it and had proper equipment brought over from Abbey Road, of all places. And then they proceeded to record quite a few tracks that ended up on the Let It Be album, were actually recorded down in this studio. As for the console that they'd paid a fortune to Magic Alex for, that ended up going for junk, and like for almost £5, I think. They'd just scrapped metal, and they'd spent like tens of thousands of pounds on it. Up on the roof, there's the flat roof up there, where at the end of the Let It Be film, they give their final live performance. It was the final performance they ever gave. That was in December of 1969. And that performance kind of went into Beatle folklore, because not only was it their last live appearance, but also it brought the London lunchtime traffic to an absolute standstill. The secretaries were leaving the offices to hear the sound. They couldn't see the Beatles because they were too far back, but they could hear it. Some people actually did go to the trouble of climbing up to the roof. And at the end of the film, you see that the police finally answer the complaints of the employers and pull the jacks out of the back of the Beatles amplifiers, and that ends the film, basically. So a very, very famous building.
Now we've come to the end of Days in the Life, the Lost Beatles archive video. I hope you've enjoyed this glimpse into the stories and the places that made up the Beatles' lives. Take care of your photographs. They're rare and precious things. Goodbye from the cavern.